Hello and welcome to Pitboards and Podiums with me, Maya Westwick. This is the first instalment in my F1 for Beginners series, so buckle up and let's start talking F1. So, hello. Today I am going to be doing the first in my F1 for Beginners series, so I'm going to basically explain a couple of things that if you are a beginner to F1, you might not know about. And even if you're not a beginner, even if you have watched it for enjoyment, if you love the entertainment aspect of it but don't really understand it, anything like that, or even if you've watched it for years and you just aren't too sure sometimes what some of the terminology means or anything like that, then hopefully I'm going to be able to explain some of that to you in this series. So today I am going to be starting off with DRS as kind of my main thing to explain, and that is because obviously DRS is something that is used every single race pretty much. Obviously, if it's a completely wet race, then no. But in the majority of races, DRS is used so much and it is mentioned all the time, and it's something that can have quite a big impact on things. So if that's something that you don't really know what it is, how it works, this episode's for you. I'm also just going to give brief explanations of some terminology as well. I am, throughout the series, basically going to do like a whole F1 glossary of information. But I'll just start with like 6 or 7 just terms that you might hear and give you the definitions for those and maybe some examples, all of that sort of thing. So let's get into it. All right, so firstly, DRS. For the brand new people, someone who literally has no idea what DRS is at all, DRS stands for drag reduction system. And this is a system, a technology within Formula One that basically was introduced in 2011 to help improve overtaking, to help encourage overtaking, and basically to try and make racing a little bit easier, because there was a bit of a problem of cars getting stuck behind in the dirty, turbulent air of the car in front and then not being able to make any moves. Which of course is something that we still do see occasionally, but DRS, the whole aim of it is basically giving the car behind an advantage to aid overtaking, provided they are within 1 second of the car in front at certain detection points around the circuit. As I've said, it's only if you're within this 1 second that you can use DRS. So you can enable DRS as long as you are, when you go through this detection point, 1 second or less behind the driver in front of you. That could also be a backmarker, so this can be used by the race leader. If they are lapping cars, it can be used to their advantage as well, potentially to, stop people chasing them down. It is something that can be used quite cleverly, but the very basics of it is that it's basically the driver, if they are within DRS range, once they get to a DRS zone, which is like basically the main straights on the circuit, and then occasionally some other areas, but predominantly just the main straights, they can press a button on their steering wheel and that will open a flap in their rear wing, which then reduces their drag levels, drag reduction system, and helps them gain top speed levels down these straights, because obviously down the straights is when you are just flat out driving. You would never use DRS in an area where you'd be braking or through corners or things like that. You can use DRS occasionally through some very, very shallow corners. There are some areas on circuits where the straight isn't technically 100% straight. It does curve around a little bit. They still use DRS on those because you're not actively going around a corner, like the way that the aerodynamics and the forces and all of that affects the car. It's not going to throw the balance off by having the rear wing open. And the way that it's detected is basically there are electronic timing loops in the track surface, and that will measure the distance between the two cars as they go over them. And then if the following car is within a second, then they can have DRS, and that's how it works. A signal is then sent to the following car to basically tell the driver that they are within DRS range. So usually that'll be like a light comes up on their dash. A lot of the time, the car in front will be told by their team that the car behind them is within DRS range, because obviously that means that there's going to be a bit of an advantage for the car behind there. They need to be aware that they need to be defending, all of that sort of thing. And then the driver will have to manually activate DRS when they enter the DRS zones. It can only be used in the designated zones. You can't press it before and then it just magically open. You have to press it at the right time. So that is something that, of course, the drivers have to think about. But equally, the drivers have to press hundreds of buttons on their steering wheels throughout the race. So that's not something that necessarily is detracting from their being able to concentrate on the race, because it's part of their job. If they were to press the button too early, then the DRS, of course, is not going to open, and they would have to press it again, and then it would be a bit of a delay, and they'd basically be losing out on some of this performance that it could give them. So that's obviously not something that they want to do. And the DRS then closes. They can close it themselves by pressing the button again if they want to, which also we have seen examples in the past. For example, Max Verstappen has had problems with his DRS before, and he's got very frustrated with it and just spammed the button and pressed it like 50 times. And the team's like, well, of course it's not going to work if you're doing that, because every time you've pressed it an even amount of times, it's going to stay closed. So you need to press it the once, and ideally it's going to work and it's going to open. But there are obviously issues with it, as there can be technical issues with every part of Formula 1. There can be technical issues with every part of a Formula 1 car. There's always going to be malfunctions. But I remember, I don't even remember what race it was, but I do remember relatively recently Max getting very, very annoyed that his DRS wasn't opening and just spamming the button as if that was going to make any difference. The driver doesn't have to close the DRS themselves. It will automatically close the rear wing flap as soon as they lift off the accelerator. So if they are no longer actually actively accelerating, it will close, and if they press the brake pedal, it will close. So, of course, going into corners, you don't want to have your DRS flap still open, because then your car will be completely unstable throughout the corner, and then there's going to be accidents and all of that. There are incidents in the past where there have been malfunctions on the DRS, and drivers have ended up crashing out of the race because they've gone to turn into a corner and they've not had the downforce that they've needed for that corner because their DRS has got stuck open. It has happened. If a driver was to get a problem with their DRS where their flap was stuck open, they would have to pit. They'd get a black and orange flag, because that is not a safe condition to be driving the car in. So they would have to pit to either fix it really fast or retire the car, depending on the kind of individual situation that is going on there. So every race, DRS is not enabled until 2 laps after the race start. And that also applies to any race restarts. So if there has been a safety car, whether it's a rolling start or a standing start, it's 2 laps after. So if it's a safety car, if it's been red flagged for any reason, if there's any reason to have to restart the race for 2 laps after that restart, you don't have DRS, the same as the first 2 laps of the race. You don't have DRS. That is because obviously at those points, the pack tends to be very, very bunched up. If you were to have DRS at that point, when everyone's all bunched up, there would be no point. The whole point of it is that it's an overtaking aid when you're stuck in dirty air. And also, everyone would be so close that everyone would have DRS, and then it just make a massive DRS train, which would be a whole other problem. Because DRS trains can be a massive issue. That's one of the reasons that some people don't like DRS, and some people think that the sport should get rid of DRS now, because if you do get stuck in a DRS train where basically there's one person in front that even with DRS, the car behind cannot get past, that car, so this car, the person in front does not have DRS, but they still can't, this car can't get past them that has DRS. And then this car has DRS on this car, but also can't get past because this car has DRS. And then this car, like, it will just keep going on. So it's not something that you want to happen in a race, because it can completely ruin a driver's race. If drivers are getting stuck in DRS trains, a lot of the time at the moment their team will try and pit them to get them out of it. They will try and undercut the others, overcut the others. They'll try and do something different with the strategy to basically get them out of that situation, because it can ruin an entire race for the driver. DRS can also be disabled at the discretion of the race director at any point if he deems that it's unsafe to continue using DRS. So, for example, if it's raining, it's very often that the DRS will be disabled, because you need to have as much downforce as possible in the rain to be able to stay on the track. It's also possible that DRS will be disabled in certain areas if there's debris on track, if there's been an incident, if someone's had an off, all of that sort of thing, if there's yellow flags out. Basically anything where safety has to come first, DRS will be disabled because, of course, with reduced drag, there is slightly less control of the car in terms of there's not as much downforce and therefore it's a lot easier to lose control. Obviously, in a normal situation, then that's very rarely going to happen, but it is a possibility. So if there are times that it's potentially too much of a risk, then they will disable the DRS. During practice and qualifying sessions, drivers can use DRS also at any point in the DRS zones. They don't have to have a car 1 second ahead of them to be able to use it, and they can then use that to be able to get the most out of their laps, to get the fastest lap times for the qualifying sessions, and also to just get the data that the teams need in the practice sessions. And if anybody has any more questions or anything about DRS, I've basically covered all of the theoretical side of it, other than literally going into the engineering, how you build a DRS flap. If anyone has any questions about DRS or anything, then do just let me know. You can contact me on the Pitboards and Podiums TikTok, which is at Pitboards and Podiums, all one word, or on my own Instagram, which is at Maya Westwick, at MAIAWESTWICK_. So you can contact me on either of those if you have any questions and you want me to cover anything else about DRS. I'm just thinking, in terms of the legality of it and in terms of the engineering of it, there are of course regulations that all the teams have to adhere to, and I can remember in recent years there was an incident in which Red Bull had gone to the FIA about Mercedes. Very common occurrence with the two teams going to the FIA about each other, but Red Bull had gone to the FIA about Mercedes rear wing, basically saying that they thought that Mercedes rear wing wasn't legal, and the FIA introduced a new test on the DRS flap about the width of how wide it is able to open, and Lewis Hamilton's car failed it because it was a new test, and he failed it by literally, I think it was like 0.1 of a millimetre or something. It was something ridiculous, and then that meant that he was disqualified. I think that was in 2021. That sounds like a 2021 thing to have happened. That was a very spicy season. And yeah, I remember there was a whole thing with wings, and then Max touched the rear wing of Lewis's car, so then he got fined like €50,000 or something because he'd touched it, and then they'd done this test and it had failed the test. So then people were like, wow, how do you know that it's not failed the test? Because Max has touched it. He's not the Hulk, he's not going to have done anything, but you know what I mean. It was a whole thing. Anyway, I am going to move on to talking about just some generic kind of terms you might hear the commentators use, you might hear the drivers use, all of that sort of thing. Just terms around Formula One that maybe you don't necessarily know the exact meaning of, all of that sort of thing, just so that you've got a little bank of glossary going on. So I'll literally just give you some definitions. If I can think of any examples, I'll give you examples, but sometimes for some of them you don't really need them, if that makes sense. So yeah, the first one that I'm going to talk to you about is apex. So you might hear the term apex a lot when you're talking about racing lines, when you're talking about like a qualifying lap, if you're talking about incidents that happen at corners. A lot of the time they will argue if there's been an accident or an incident where one driver has potentially forced another driver off the track, they'll question whether that driver was on the correct racing line, whether that driver was going to have hit the apex or not, all of that sort of thing. Like with the Silverstone 2021 crash with Lewis and Max, there was this whole argument that Lewis wasn't going to have hit the apex, which is why he ended up getting a penalty for it, because he was predominantly deemed to be at fault for the incident because he wasn't on the racing line, even though there was space for Max to have backed out. Max didn't have to back out, and then it was a whole thing. So basically, the apex of a corner is the innermost point of the driving line that's taken through the corner. So every corner has an apex. It is the innermost point of that corner. It's the innermost point of where the car will be going through that corner. And a driver will always aim to hit the apex to ensure that they are taking the straightest possible line through that corner and maintaining the highest possible speed through it, which of course is optimizing their lap time. In terms of a racing context, obviously there's always individual times that they're not going to take the racing line for whatever reason, like if they're battling or anything like that. But generally, a driver will try and take the optimal racing line, and hit the apex of each corner to ensure that they are getting the fastest lap times and the most sustainable lap times as well, in terms of tyre wear, in terms of all of that sort of thing, which I'm not going to go into now. Just so that they know that they have enough in them to build enough of a gap to the driver behind, to make up enough of a gap to the driver in front, all of that sort of thing in a racing context. In a qualifying context, of course, they're going to want to be taking the optimal line because they want to have the fastest lap. So the way you have the fastest lap is by being able to maintain the highest speed consistently throughout the lap. And the way you do that is by hitting the apex, by braking into the corner as much as you need to while maintaining as much speed as possible, which you do by taking the straightest line possible. So again, it's very important in terms of speed and in terms of that sort of thing. Aerodynamics are incredibly, incredibly important in Formula One. They are something that millions and millions and millions of pounds is spent every year on designing and testing and all of that sort of thing to do with Formula One cars. And every car is built to try and get performance as optimal as possible in terms of aerodynamics. Now, the teams all have access to wind tunnels, and that is how they can test their aerodynamics. That's how they can physically see it. Some teams have access to incredible people who can kind of visualize it themselves. Like Red Bull have Adrian Newey. He is a master of aerodynamics and of aerodynamic engineering, and he is able to literally see how things will affect the aerodynamics of a car without the wind tunnel, and then it goes into the wind tunnel and he's like, yeah, that's what I said. But every single team tries to make their car as aerodynamically optimal as possible, because aerodynamics are literally the way that the air behaves when it interacts with the car, and you want to achieve the perfect balance between speed and stability, because aerodynamics can slow you down, but equally aerodynamics can make you incredibly fast but have no stability in the car, that you can go around a corner and you are not even on the track. So it's very important that you get this balance between being as fast as possible and actually having enough downforce and having enough contact with the surface and enough force between the tyres and the road that you're not just sliding, because at the end of the day you need to be in control of the car. You need to be able to drive as fast as you possibly can and feel secure in the fact that the car is going to do what you ask it to do. It's going to turn the way you ask it to turn, all of that sort of thing. This is what you're going to hear as well. I'll get into under and oversteer properly in another episode, but under and oversteer are both massive in terms of aerodynamics. You'll hear a lot of drivers talk about it. You might hear them say that the car's being snappy. You might hear them say about their front end or their rear end, about the way that it's the way that it's acting. That's all to do with aerodynamics, but it's particularly important and also very challenging for when the driver is navigating high-speed straights and challenging corners. So obviously on a high-speed straight, you're not having to worry about the cornering aspect of it, but you're having to consider the aerodynamics in terms of making it as streamlined as possible to be as fast as possible. We have seen in recent years with Mercedes how they went with this whole zero side pods concept that didn't work, that they were literally a sitting duck on the straights because every other team was so much better aerodynamically on the straights that the Mercedes was just basically going backwards compared to everyone else down the straights because they got the aerodynamics wrong. But then through the corners, this is when you're going to lose control of the car if the aerodynamics are not right. Also, the teams can adjust this during the race weekend using their front and rear wings. They can adjust the angles of things. There are things they can do on the car that will change the setup slightly, and depending on the circuit, depending on what Grand Prix it is, the weather conditions, all of that sort of thing, they will also take different packages to different Grand Prix. So somewhere like Mexico City, for example, that's very high altitude, the downforce effect is going to be very different there than it would be somewhere like Monaco. So you're going to take very different packages and different size rear wings, different aerodynamic features to each of those races that are kind of track specific in order to actually get the most out of the car. I mean, this year, what race was it? This year we had a race that McLaren absolutely got wrong. Where was it? They just took the complete wrong package. I can't remember where it was. McLaren, they just absolutely took the complete wrong package. I think it might have been Sao Paulo, might have been Brazil or Mexico. It was a circuit that if it had rained, they would have been fine, but it didn't rain. It rained during qualifying, but it didn't rain during the race. So they were so slow. They were just so slow. It might have been earlier in the season than that, actually. I don't remember. But yeah, it can be that teams massively get it wrong with aerodynamics, and when that happens, there's basically nothing the drivers can do, because either the car is incredibly slow and they literally can't go any faster, or when they go fast, they have no control over the car and it spins, and then they have damages and they have crashes and it's not safe. So it is a very fine line between speed and stability, but it's something that is very important in Formula One. And it's something that the teams, if they get right, they really can get right. The next term that I'm going to talk about is backmarker. A backmarker is basically a slower car that's being lapped by the leading cars. Sometimes they can get lapped multiple times in a race. That's not uncommon for that to happen, for a driver to finish 2 or 3 laps down if they are in a particularly slower car. Backmarkers will be shown blue flags by the marshals, which tells them that a much faster leading car is approaching them. It's a car that is on a lap ahead of them, and it basically tells them that they need to move safely out of the way to let them pass without any fight, because they are not racing them. They are a whole lap down, at least, on this person, and they need to move out of the way without affecting this other driver's race, basically. Backmarkers generally are in teams that don't have as much funding behind them. In recent years, we've had backmarkers. The teams have been like Haas. I mean, this year we've had like AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo, Williams. And Haas. It's the teams that are towards the bottom of the grid pretty consistently, very rarely score points, all of that sort of thing. Sometimes backmarkers can massively affect a race. Even in terms of championships, they can do that. Nicholas Latifi, for example, driving for Williams in Abu Dhabi 2021, he crashed. He was a backmarker. He was nothing to do with the race. And he crashed at turn 6, I think it was. And that is basically the reason that Lewis Hamilton is not an 8-time world champion. Even though they're not directly involved in any sort of battles, they can massively impact them still. They're still obviously very valid in terms of being in Formula One. Formula One is a very competitive sport, and a lot of the time it is just about how much money you can put into it, and that's why there is the budget cap, to kind of ensure that the smaller teams do get a chance and they're not always just stuck being backmarkers. And we have started seeing that. I mean, we've seen towards the end of this year that AlphaTauri have been doing a bit better, all of that sort of thing. And it's very, very interesting, definitely, seeing the backmarkers kind of switch around a bit. It's also very easy for teams to fall down to the backmarkers. I mean, think about Williams. Historically, in Formula One, Williams has such an incredible legacy. But then in terms of recent years in Formula One, they've not really achieved a lot. So it's just kind of the circle of life in Formula One. And the next term I'm going to talk about is blistering. Blistering is used to describe the formation of like bubbles or raised areas on a tyre's surface. That's usually due to excessive heat, which obviously the tyres go through such intense heats when they're being used in a race or in qualifying. That, of course, presents quite a significant challenge for the drivers, because they lose a lot of grip. So then trying to maintain optimal grip and stability on track for the drivers can become very difficult, although it is possible to kind of drive through the blistering. That's something that Lewis Hamilton historically has been very good at. He's very good at looking after his tyres. Checo Perez historically is also very good at looking after his tyres. So a lot of the time you will hear on the team radio that Lewis will say that his tyres have blistered, his tyres have gone, and then he'll get like this whole resurgence of life in them because he's able to kind of drive through that and not let that affect him and his driving so much that he needs to change his tyres right there and then. But equally, it's also very, very easy for blistering to ruin a driver's race if they were to blister far too soon, and then it ruins their pit stop strategy because they have to pit there and then because their tyres have absolutely gone. So it's just kind of another thing that they have to manage. Bottoming is when the chassis of a Formula 1 car makes contact with the track. That often results in like suspension compressing down, and then it hinders performance unless very kind of strategic adjustments can be made to counter that effect. But obviously they can't necessarily really do that during the race. That's kind of a race weekend through the practice sessions, working out what they can do to adjust the setup. It can massively unsettle the car, bottoming can, and it can lead to crashes. I mean, this year in Las Vegas, Lando Norris had quite a big crash, literally on lap 3. He effectively just became a passenger in his car because he went over a bump in the track that caused the car to bottom out, and then he just had no control of the car anymore. Like, it's very easy for bottoming to be a very, very big problem. If it's something that they can't really reduce the effect of, it can end a driver's race very easily. But it can just be a bit of a squeaky bum moment where they're like, oh, nearly lost it there. So it kind of depends on the situation. Camber in Formula 1 refers to the tilting of the car's wheels from a vertical axis, and that is in order to achieve optimal speed and stability, especially during corners. Usually what will happen is the tyres on a Formula 1 car, especially the front tyres, will have a negative camber that is to improve the performance in corners. And that means that rather than the tops of the wheels being just perpendicular to the ground, parallel to each other, they are angled inward slightly towards the car, and that basically changes the surface area that makes contact with the track, and then that helps improve cornering speed. And the last word that I'm going to cover today is chicane. So a chicane is a series of corners on a circuit, normally that is used to slow the cars down, that features at least 2 changes in direction. So chicanes often are added to high-speed sections of the track to slow the cars down and encourage more overtaking, while also often improving safety. Chicanes can be very bad places for battles, depending on the specific chicanes and depending on the drivers involved. For example, 2021 Monza, Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen at the turn 1 chicane, that could have been a very serious accident, especially if we didn't have the halo now, which of course we do. If that accident had happened 10 years ago, Lewis probably wouldn't be alive anymore. So chicanes, when driven through them properly, can be great. They can be a little bit annoying. I know, for example, in Barcelona, the chicane, I think they've just taken it out. There was a chicane that basically killed the action rather than making there be more action. It took out a high-speed corner and added a bus stop chicane, and it just kind of, people didn't love it. I think they've removed it, but we're moving away from Barcelona anyway in a few years, so we won't get much more action there, unfortunately, for the moment. Monaco has a lot of chicanes as well, although Monaco is a very unique track in its nature anyway, with it being a bit more of a qualifying circuit than a race circuit. But yeah, chicanes, most circuits will have a chicane somewhere, and they are primarily used to encourage more overtaking, to slow things down in the high-speed sections, because when a car has to slow down, it brings it closer to the car behind it, which can encourage overtaking. But yeah, it's just, chicanes can be a bad place to overtake when both drivers are unwilling to give up their position. But that's a pretty unique situation. Most of the time they'll race hard, but they'll race fair for the majority of the time. It's only occasionally that doesn't happen. But yes, that's everything for this first episode of F1 for beginners. I'm going to be posting these weekly up until the start of the 2024 Formula 1 season, at least. So if there are any specific things that you want me to cover, as I've already said, just let me know on TikTok or Instagram, or in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. And don't forget, if you have enjoyed this podcast, to like, rate, subscribe, all of that sort of thing, depending on what platform you are listening or watching to this on. So it's been lovely talking to you. I hope you all have a lovely, lovely couple of days. And I'll see you in a few days for my first episode about a person. So you've got, on the 3rd of January, you've got an episode about Michael Schumacher coming, with it being his birthday. I thought it'd be nice to post it on then. And I will be doing a little Legends of F1 series, but I will, after I've done the Michael Schumacher episode, I will focus predominantly on just the 2024 drivers first, so that it's like a nice little introduction to them before the season starts, and then I can go back to the Legends of F1. I just wanted to talk about Michael Schumacher first because I love him. But yeah, thank you very much for listening or watching, and I will be back in your ears very soon. Bye!